In the final hour before the seismic shift, the palace went eerily silent until the gates locked with a thunderous clank that echoed across Westminster. No media alerts, no warning, just royal cars rerouted, red lights overridden, and Camilla's personal staff instructed to stand by for immediate reassignment. What had been whispered for months erupted in a single command, and the monarchy would never be the same again. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with an unscheduled directive issued just before dawn. Armed royal security discreetly surrounded Buckingham and Clarence House, not with fanfare but with a quiet, calculated presence. Long-time members of Camilla's team, many of whom had enjoyed decades of comfort within royal corridors, were removed from their positions without explanation. Their phones were confiscated, their passes revoked. In the chaos, one of Camilla's most senior advisors was said to have collapsed in shock, unsure whether they were witnessing a coup or a coordinated elevation. Meanwhile, Catherine's convoy was rerouted from her scheduled engagement, swept into the palace under full blackout protocol. The Royal Communications Unit went dark. Not a single post, not a single leak. No one outside that inner circle knew what was happening, and that was by design. For weeks, a coded language had been practiced among palace operatives. Phrases like Crown Condition Alpha and Windsor Protocol 11 weren't just jargon, they were the triggers for a shift in power few believed would ever actually be activated. As sirens blared softly in the background and coded phrases buzzed across royal radio lines, a single piece of intelligence made its way through a locked corridor, a letter, hand-delivered by none other than Princess Anne. That envelope, sealed with an insignia not seen since the Queen's final year, was the spark. It contained instructions meant to remain hidden until the monarchy reached what the late sovereign had referred to as its crossroads of legacy. Simultaneously, the Queen's Council was summoned to the Lancaster Room. No media were informed, no statements were prepared, no public-facing document was released. What unfolded next was conducted behind layers of tradition, law, and silence, a kind of controlled implosion. Catherine was not asked. She was called. The difference would soon matter more than the world could imagine. Within palace walls, tension rippled like a pulse. Everyone knew something irreversible had begun. And yet the public still saw nothing. To them, it was a normal morning in London, but inside, royal lives were being reshuffled, roles dismantled, loyalties tested. Camilla's office, once a symbol of her ascension, became a ghost room in under an hour. Security teams whispered of a second lockdown, but it wasn't to protect the monarchy from the outside. It was to protect one woman's rise from sabotage within. But the silence within the palace was nothing compared to the roar behind closed doors, where one woman's reign ended and another's true power began. At precisely 12:03 a.m., Catherine was summoned not as a consort, but as the kingdom's next regent. A sealed decree, marked early with the late Queen's private seal, was placed in her hands. It had been buried in archives, protected by a blood oath, and shielded from Camilla's allies for decades. Tonight, that letter would rewrite everything. What lay within that envelope had remained untouched since the final days of Queen Elizabeth II's life. Written with trembling hands and safeguarded in triple-locked protocol, the decree had never been seen by the public, and only 3 members of the royal inner circle had knowledge of its existence. It wasn't just a document, it was a final safeguard, a masterstroke reserved for the moment when the monarchy itself trembled under the weight of its own fracture. And now, as the crown stood divided behind closed doors, the time had come to unseal it. The moment Catherine's fingers brushed the parchment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. William stood behind her, silent, composed, yet visibly bracing for what they'd both suspected had been foreseen long ago. Princess Anne was already present, her expression unreadable, a portrait of unflinching duty. No words were exchanged, but their shared gaze said enough. This was not a decision. It was an inevitability. As the wax broke and the Queen's script unfurled beneath the lamplight, 3 simple lines stood out in chilling clarity. There was no ceremony in their delivery, no fanfare, no hesitation. Should the crown's stability be questioned, and should its leadership divide the realm, the regency shall fall not to the expected heir, but to the most unwavering presence within the house. A pause followed, then came the name, one word, Catherine. That was all it took. Camilla's name was nowhere on the page. Her absence from the room wasn't accidental. Security had already ensured she'd been escorted to a private chamber at Clarence's house, under the guise of an early debrief. But everyone in that council chamber knew the truth. She was being contained, not informed. It was a protective measure, yes, but also a clear signal. Her reign, whatever claim she thought she had, was over, and she wouldn't be allowed to disrupt the transition. Catherine stood motionless. The words weren't just ink, they were a vindication, a reckoning, a release. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. She spoke only one word, barely audible above the silence. Finally, a word not of triumph but of relief, pain and acceptance all folded into one breath. For years she had played the part, held her tongue, protected the institution, but the institution had now turned to her, not just as its future, but its salvation. There was one clause in the decree that none of them had expected, a hidden line tucked beneath the Queen's signature. In the event of fractured public trust, the regency must pass to the most stable figure. Stability is not crowned, it is earned. With those words, every unspoken doubt about Catherine's quiet strength crystallized into command. She was not being handed power, she was being acknowledged for already holding it. But the moment Catherine accepted that decree, she unleashed a chain reaction that the monarchy was ill-prepared to control. Camilla never saw it coming. Surrounded by portraits of past queens she once believed she'd joined, she was handed a single envelope. Your services are no longer required. The betrayal didn't come from the press, nor from the public, but from someone seated 2 doors down. She opened the envelope slowly, refusing to believe what her instincts already screamed. Her hands shook, but her pride forced composure. At the bottom of the page, where she expected to see Charles's steady signature, was a name she hadn't anticipated. Anne, Princess Anne. The ever-silent sentinel of the monarchy had made the decision not as a sister-in-law, but as the crown's enforcer. In that one stroke of ink, Camilla was not just dismissed, she was erased. The authority she had clung to, the image she had cultivated, dissolved into the air, like it had never belonged to her in the first place. The silence that followed was louder than any scandal. Her inner circle, once fiercely protective and carefully curated, evaporated. Phones stopped ringing, texts went unanswered. Doors that had once opened for her without hesitation were now firmly locked. One senior aide avoided eye contact entirely as he briskly walked past her in the hallway, carrying a stack of files that until last night would have been under her review. Outside the royal gallery, a discreet team was already boxy, inking up her portraits, her name plaques, and every trace of her presence in spaces that had never truly accepted her. Desperation set in. Camilla reached for the phone and dialed the one person she believed could stop this, the king. But her call didn't even make it to his private line. It was rerouted to an aide, then forwarded to voicemail. No return message, no explanation. Just an empty silence that told her more than any words ever could. The man she had stood beside in every photo, every speech, every storm was gone from her side when it mattered most. And in his place stood a monarch who had already turned the page. But perhaps the cruelest twist of all wasn't the letter, nor the silence, nor the vanishing loyalty. It was the betrayal from within. A member of her personal staff, one she had trusted without hesitation, had been the very individual who tipped off the Regency team of her activities, her concerns, even her suspicions. That betrayal hadn't come from a rival. It came from the warmth of her own orbit, and by the time she realized it, the trap had already snapped shut. She wasn't fighting for power anymore, she was fighting against complete irrelevance. Yet the storm inside Camilla's chambers paled in comparison to the revelation. Catherine was about to unveil a truth buried deeper than any royal oath, behind the grand smiles and public loyalty. A covert council had been meeting for months, its sole purpose to end Camilla's authority and install a stabilizing force. Led by Princess Anne and Prince Edward, this operation had one name: Operation Nightingale. What began as quiet concern turned into deliberate strategy. Anne, ever the stoic guardian of tradition, had grown increasingly wary of Camilla's erratic decisions and the optics surrounding her role. Edward, usually cautious to a fault, was the first to articulate what others only whispered behind: gilded doors that the crown could not afford a second fracture. Together, the siblings began laying the groundwork for a transition that would preserve the monarchy's image, even if it meant going against the king's wife. They operated in shadows, masking their movements beneath the facade of estate visits, archival inspections, and ceremonial planning. But every conversation had one destination: removing Camilla without tearing the institution apart. Meetings were held in obscure locations across the country: Sandringham's unused wing, a private lodge in Balmoral, even a sealed room beneath Windsor's chapel vaults. No notes were taken. Phones were banned. The fewer the traces, the better. Over time, they quietly amassed a dossier: mismanaged patronages, ill-advised political commentary, internal staff disputes, and a trail of private letters that contradicted public statements. None of it was explosive on its own, but together, it painted a damning portrait of instability, a portrait they believed could no longer be ignored. Prince William was brought in only when the operation reached a critical point. At first, he resisted. His loyalty to his father made him cautious. But once presented with the full weight of the evidence and the clear risk to the crown's future, his stance shifted. What sealed it was the polling data, collected quietly through private firms. Public trust in Camilla was not merely low, it was declining with every passing month. The crown was vulnerable, and it needed reinforcement from someone the people already viewed as stable, compassionate, and commanding without ever demanding power. There was only one figure who matched that profile. And yet, in a move that defined their loyalty to the institution rather than any individual, Anne and Edward made a chilling decision. Catherine was not to be informed until the final moment. The logic was ruthless. By inching her in the dark, they preserved her innocence. No one could accuse her of staging a coup. No whispers of ambition, no fingerprints on the knife. When the time came, she would rise untouched by conspiracy, and more importantly, completely above suspicion. The name, Operation Nightingale, wasn't chosen at random. It was Anne's idea, borrowed from the image of silent healing and quiet strength, but it was also symbolic. The nightingale does not sing to boast, it sings to guide, to warn, to awaken. And that's what they believed Catherine would do for the crown: restore clarity in the darkness. What they didn't anticipate, however, was how Catherine would evolve once thrust into the very center of the storm. She would not remain the quiet protector. She would become something far more powerful. But even as Anne and Edward pulled the strings, there was one force neither of them anticipated: Catherine's own transformation under pressure. For years, Catherine played the role the firm demanded: graceful, measured, compliant. But in a single stroke, that mask shattered. Before the royal family and top advisors, she rose not as William's wife, but as sovereign in waiting, calm, controlled, and entirely unflinching. When she entered the Privy Council chamber, the air shifted. Gone was the quiet figure shadowing events with perfect posture and polite smiles. In her place stood a woman, hardened by silence, sharpened by restraint, and now ready to claim the role destiny had long whispered was hers. Catherine didn't ask for permission, she delivered a mandate. "I will not let history repeat itself," she declared, her voice unwavering. It wasn't a speech, it was a reckoning, and in that moment, the institution that had once underestimated her bowed not out of obligation, but out of awe. While others scrambled in the chaos of Camilla's removal, Catherine executed a flawless reorganization of the Crown's core operations. Logistics, security, and communications were brought under immediate lockdown, not with panic, but with precision. She reframed the narrative before the press could twist it, anchoring the shift in legacy, integrity, and stability. She knew the headlines would come. She knew the speculation would swirl. But she also knew that power unchallenged was power unearned, and Catherine was prepared to earn every inch of what had been entrusted to her. She did not act alone, but she did lead. In mere minutes, she sealed strategic alliances that would take most monarchs years to secure. Sophie Wessex stepped into the role of senior advisor, and Princess Anne, the architect behind the curtain, aligned publicly beside her. Their unity wasn't just symbolic, it was surgical. 3 women, 3 generations, 1 mission: restore the crown's moral compass. Yet, there was no room for revenge. Catherine refused to gloat. Her first private order made that clear: an internal audit of all royal expenditures, appointments, and patronages, not to punish Camilla, but to cleanse what had been muddied. "The people must know we serve them," she said, "not ourselves." And in the quiet moments that followed the storm, she returned home not to review press briefings or prepare for interviews, but to kneel beside her children. No crown, no titles. Just a mother promising them that the path forward would be one of courage, not chaos. They didn't understand the scale of what had shifted, but they knew something in her had changed. And that change wasn't temporary, it was transformation. But as Catherine stepped into the light, a darker truth loomed, one that would shake even her to the core. When King Charles was informed of Catherine's assumption of power, he didn't object. He wept. Alone in Balmoral, far from the chaos in London, he made one final call to William. "What, he said during that 11-minute conversation, changed the course of royal history forever. There was no shouting, no denials, just the weight of silence between a father and son who both knew the storm had been coming for years. Charles listened, then spoke with a gentleness that broke the edge of protocol. It was never meant to fall on her, he admitted. But deep inside, he knew it always would. This wasn't surrender, it was recognition. What the world would never see was the quiet deal struck months earlier between Charles and Anne, a pact made in whispers and guarded with precision, a contingency plan if the monarchy fractured under its own contradictions. Camilla, he confessed, had never been part of that clause. What shocked the inner circle wasn't just the king's acceptance, it was the depth of his isolation. The man once feared for his temper was now rendered fragile by reality. A former advisor, later dismissed and silenced, leaked a private recording believed to be captured just hours after the handover. In it, Charles's voice trembled. "Tell Catherine, I trust her more than anyone now." The heartbreak was not over losing power, but over realizing the distance that had quietly grown between himself and the woman he once fought the world to crown. Camilla had not been informed of the agreement with Anne. She had been kept in the dark, not just by the palace, but by Charles himself. The truth was more complex than betrayal. Charles had felt the shift long before it became public. His declining health, whispers of which had only begun to circle behind polished doors, meant he could no longer be the force that held the crown's centre. He had hoped Camilla would rise to fill that space, but in recent months, he saw it more clearly with each misstep, each cold headline, and each emotional absence. He saw it in the way the public clung to Catherine, in the way William leaned on her, in the way Anne, who never yielded to sentiment, quietly endorsed her. During the final call, William's voice did not break, but his message carried the gravity of everything their family had endured. "We'll protect your legacy," he said, "but it starts with truth." Charles didn't argue. He didn't plead. He only asked that the transition be handled with dignity, not for Camilla's sake, but for the crown's. As he hung up, it was said he stared at the portrait of his mother and whispered, "You were right." But not everyone accepted Catherine's rise. One silent faction remained loyal to Camilla, and they were ready to strike back. As Catherine assumed the regency, not everyone bowed in allegiance. A rogue faction comprised of senior advisors, Camilla's longtime friends, and foreign backers began leaking documents, sowing doubt, and threatening to destabilize the crown. Their goal? Reinstall Camilla by force or by scandal. The first warning came through palace security channels in the form of intercepted back messages, encrypted, fragmented, and traced to numbers that should never have been active. They spoke of timing, of exposure, of correcting the mistake before it becomes irreversible. Within hours, Catherine's private office was flooded with reports of shadow communications bouncing between dismissed aides, political intermediaries, and figures who had once orbited Camilla's influence. The palace hadn't merely shifted power, it had awakened a resistance. Then came the threats. Anonymous sources began hinting at the release of private correspondence, allegedly involving Catherine letters, messages, fragments of conversations meant to paint her not as a stabilizing force, but as an emotionally driven opportunist. None were published. Yet, the implication alone was designed to weaken her authority before it could harden. Every whisper carried the same undertone. She was not ready, not strong enough, not entitled to stand where she now stood. Inside Parliament, the disruption grew bolder. Advisors once aligned with Camilla quietly lobbied for procedural delays, attempting to stall formal recognition of the regency. Meetings were postponed, votes were challenged, protocol was questioned in language that sounded neutral but reeked of intent. At the same time, carefully planted opinion pieces surfaced, written under false names, portraying Catherine as overwhelmed, unstable, and emotionally compromised. They dissected her past, distorted her silence into weakness, and framed her composure as concealment. It was psychological warfare, slow, strategic, and relentless. William saw it for what it was, and he acted. Without public acknowledgement, he authorized a full counterintelligence sweep inside royal operations. Phones were monitored, access was restricted, long-trusted officials found themselves quietly reassigned or escorted out. Every corridor carried suspicion. Every greeting masked calculation. The crown was no longer just guarding its image, it was protecting its nerve center from collapse. And then came the betrayal that cut deepest. A cousin, someone who had stood beside Catherine just hours earlier, offering support, pledging unity, was identified as the conduit through which several of the back-channel communications had passed. Not the mastermind, but a willing passage. Whether driven by loyalty, fear, or ambition, no one could yet say. What mattered was this: the fracture had reached blood, and once that line is crossed, nothing remains untouched. But in the midst of the palace wars, Catherine revealed the ace that would silence every critic and end the debate forever. Hidden in the Queen's personal safe, sealed by 3 royal witnesses, lay a final message meant only for the moment the monarchy found itself fractured. Catherine opened it in front of the council, and as her voice broke while reading, even her harshest critics stood silent. The letter was not addressed to the crown, nor to the future monarch. It was addressed, simply, to the one who brings balance. Every breath held in that room paused as Catherine unfolded the parchment, yet alive with the weight of finality. In the late Queen's own handwriting, the message began with solemn reflection, but quickly transitioned to an undeniable truth. Elizabeth had foreseen division. She had sensed the fragility of legacy and the vanity of succession, and buried within her final words was the name no one dared expect Catherine. She called her the quiet strength this crown shall rely upon, not because of title or lineage, but because of character. She praised her resolve, her restraint, and her rare ability to wield grace like a weapon. In a single sentence, Queen Elizabeth dismantled every narrative that had painted Catherine as passive. She had not been overlooked. She had been watched, tested, and ultimately chosen. The monarch who ruled longer than any in British history had left her final vote not for tradition, but for stability. The pressed letter carried more than an endorsement. It carried warnings. Elizabeth wrote of loyalty built on ego, and of alliances formed not to serve the people, but to serve the self. Her words cast a long, cold shadow over Camilla's ambitions without ever mentioning her name directly, but one sentence stood apart. A single line delivered with sharp intent. Let no one seek what was never promised. The meaning wasn't debated. It didn't need to be. Camilla had reached for a crown that had never truly been hers to grasp. As the message continued, Elizabeth's reverence for Anne emerged with force. She thanked her daughter for guarding the house when no one else would, for protecting the spirit of service while others indulged in ceremony. That inclusion was more than sentimental. It validated Anne's role in orchestrating the quiet transfer of power and fortified Catherine's ascension as one rooted in continuity, not rebellion. By the time Catherine reached the final lines, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Hardened advisors, some of whom had doubted her, wiped away tears. Political appointees sat stunned, unable to speak. It wasn't just a letter, it was a torch passed across generations. The Queen's last sentence echoed through the chamber like thunder, veiled in grace. When the moment comes, let my faith be her crown. And just like that, any room for debate evaporated. With the Queen's blessing in hand, Catherine prepared to make the most shocking public move, yet one that would end an era. At precisely 5 p.m., Catherine appeared before the nation, not as princess, not as consort, but as regent. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering, and her words, delivered with royal poise and the weight of 1,000 years of history, left the world stunned. Broadcast live across all royal and national channels, the address was brief but monumental. There was no palace backdrop, no ceremonial display, just Catherine standing at the nexus of a nation torn between past loyalties and future hopes. In her first sentence, she confronted the moment head-on, acknowledging the deep transition that had shaken the House of Windsor. Change, she said, does not erase legacy, but it must demand responsibility. With those words, she didn't just assume power, she reframed it. The country wasn't being told what had happened. It was being invited to see what would happen next. She didn't mince words. A full review of royal protocols was underway, every tradition, every title, every expenditure, all subject to scrutiny. It was a clear message to the public and to the institution itself. The Crown would no longer be immune to reform. In a move no one expected, she extended an open invitation to accountability. She committed to publishing regular transparency reports, a historic first in the monarchy's modern era. Her aim wasn't to defend the regency. It was to earn it, day by day, in front of the people it was sworn to serve. But perhaps the most poignant moment came when she turned to the man who once wore the crown. His Majesty the King, she said with deep emotion, has not stepped down but stepped aside with courage. His legacy is ours to protect. With grace, she made clear that Charles had not been overthrown, but honoured in a way few leaders are in truth, and with the dignity of knowing when to pass the torch. As for Camilla, there was no bitterness, no direct address, only the line, some chapters close with silence, and we must let them. It was not erasure, it was mercy. Her closing words echoed like a bell over a nation that had, for too long, held its breath. The crown belongs not to the past, but to those who carry it with grace. There was no applause, no anthem, just the sound of a future being forged in real time by a woman who never needed a title to command the world's attention, only her truth. The monarchy didn't fall that day, it transformed. And at the center of it stood a woman who never asked for power, but proved she was born to carry it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.